Before we talk about another topic concerning doubting Dawkins, I have to make a little bit of a confession. This particular talk should have been pretty easy for me since I have a background in theology, and that is what we're going to be talking about. But when I was looking at what Dawkins said about God and Christianity, I was quite upset and frustrated at the fact that such a prominent figure could so readily and seemingly without any kind of consequence distort the facts concerning God and Jesus. But when I started to do that and thought about it a little bit, I had to acknowledge that I, in my days previous to being a Christian, was very much like Dawkins. And I was not above playing loose with the truth in order to win an argument. In fact, I undoubtedly said many things that misrepresented Christianity and also misrepresented the truth. So when I came to protest this to God, I got silence. And so this is a little bit of a confession before we start. And if by any chance you happen to be around me in those pre-Christian days when I was still in high school and that negatively affected you, I apologize. But anyway, let's look at this week's challenge to Dawkins. Dawkins claims and states, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, a misogynist, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniac, sadomasochist, capriciously malevolent bully. That's a mouthful. I would just state a few things here. First of all, yes, there are many things in the Old Testament that are disturbing to us. But just because the Bible records them does not mean that God condones them. And so many of the things that Richard Dawkins is saying as horrific or complaining about here in this brief quote are things that are recorded in Scripture, but certainly not condoned by God. There are a few passages where God talks about wiping out certain people, and those are difficult. But having said that, to speak of God's character as if this is what's revealed in Scripture is misrepresentative. Scripture over and over again shows God to be one that is loving and faithful and cares for His people and provides for His people. And if he wants to argue that God is the most reprehensible character in fiction, I can only assume that he's referring to the gods. I think he should study a little more history. The gods that were around during the Old Testament were far more brutal, demanded far more in the way of sacrifice, and also expected worship practices that we would consider horrific. Let's just give you a few examples. Baal, the main rival to God in the Old Testament, frequently demanded sacrifices, but is often also associated with human sacrifice and in rare occasions even child sacrifice. Asheroth was the goddess often associated with Baal and worship of her involved ritualistic prostitution, read slavery, and many men and women, boys and girls, were enslaved in these worship practices. As well, just to note, another goddess, Sybil, whose priests were obligated as a final act of initiation to castrate themselves. So those are just a few examples of some of the contemporary gods that were around when the Old Testament was written, and it seems far from a stretch to say that they were reprehensible in their expectations on people and evil in a way that the God of the Old Testament was not. Dawkins also wants to discredit Christianity, and I will again quote something for you. The only difference between the Da Vinci Code and the Gospels is the Gospels are ancient fiction while the Da Vinci Code is modern fiction. He goes on to say, it is even possible to mount a serious, though not widely supported, historical case that Jesus never lived at all, as has been made known, among others, by Professor G.A. Wells of the University of London in a number of books, including Did Jesus Exist? Now, that all sounds very official, and he's got the endorsement, or he quotes Professor G.A. Wells of the University of London, who has now passed away. But G.A. Wells was a professor not in the study of ancient history, but a professor of German, and had no background in ancient history whatsoever, or any of the other relevant fields, including theology, classics, and so was no expert to be quoted by Dawkins. In fact, a simple Google search will reveal that the historicity of Jesus Christ is a fact. There is more evidence for Jesus Christ as a historical figure than any other ancient person we know of by a long shot. There are thousands and thousands of New Testament manuscripts. There is the writing of Josephus, the Jewish historian, writing in between 93 and 94 AD, who references to Jesus Christ several times. Pliny the Younger, a governor in Rome, writes to Emperor Trajan in about 112 AD, giving practices of the Christians and referring to the fact that they worship Jesus as a god. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in 115 AD, talks about Christians in a very negative way, but still acknowledges that this cult sprang up in Judea after Jesus was crucified. Also makes reference in that same quote to Nero blaming the fires in Rome on the same Christians. And there are also other early Christian writings. First Clement, which was written as early as 70 AD. The Didache, which is dated somewhere between 50 and 100 AD. And the martyrdom of Polycarp, 160 to 170 AD. These are all very close to the time of Christ. Dawkins also makes claims about religious belief itself. He claims that religion is a virus, and that raising a child in the faith is similar to pedophilia. Christopher Hitchens comes close to saying much the same thing in his book, God is Not Great. But once again, history paints a very different picture. The Christian faith in the time of the Romans was noted even by its enemies of being a faith that loved others. They loved one another. They also looked after their neighbors. Very common practice in the time of Jesus was the practice of abandoning unwanted children by roadsides or on hillsides or even in garbage heaps or dung heaps. If a father did not want the child, or if it was born with a birth defect, or if it happened not to be a male and they wanted a male, they might just take that child and either leave it by the roadside, or there was in some places mountainsides and hills where they would leave their unwanted children. Christians, seeing this as an abhorrent practice, would come and collect these children and raise them as their own. Another thing that Christians were known for doing that is quite relevant today is that when plagues would be visited upon cities, the wealthy and anyone who could afford to would leave the city and leave the sick and dying to fend for themselves. The Christians stayed behind and looked after these people. And sometimes they got better and sometimes they didn't, but it gave them a reputation for helping people. They were also known for helping the poor. They fought for the rights of slaves and ultimately for the abolishment of slavery. They did the same for women's rights, and this was all based on the Christian belief that all people are created in the image of God. Virtually every institution in Western civilization had its origins in the church, whether it be hospitals, orphanages, schools, universities, courts. All of these institutions had their origins in the church and flowed out of a desire to love the Lord their God with all their heart and to love their neighbor as themselves. Even Dawkins' own quote, his judgment on God is in fact a product of Christianity. Because before Christianity came along, there was a golden rule, but it was might is right. And there would be no questioning a God and the practices he or she demanded, because if they had power, they could enforce their will. And this was seen in Roman society. Male Romans who were citizens engaged in sexual practices outside of marriage with whomever they wanted. They would abuse slaves, male and female. They frequented brothels, and none of this was questioned. It was the Christian faith that solidified the family as the core unit of civilization. It was Christianity that demanded that men and women were to practice self-control for the benefit of their community and for the glory of God. Dawkins claims elsewhere that something like the golden rule, do unto others as you have done to yourself, is innate in biology. But that was certainly not seen as the case in ancient times. The idea that the Christians would look after the poor was something completely foreign to pagans. And even after Christianity was established as a state religion, and there was an effort by an emperor to reinstate paganism, he could not motivate the pagan priest to care for the poor in the same way the church did without even asking. But the fact that the golden rule is not written on the human heart does not only have ancient proof, but more recent proof as well. You don't have to go back far in history to see that when Christianity is removed, that the golden rule, or the concept that we are all equal, quickly fades away. In fact, just after Darwinism was accepted in England and in Germany, those who were supporting Darwin's views quickly came to a very different conclusion. In fact, they were convinced that, far from being equal, that because of evolution, human beings were to be valued differently. Darwin suggested that more primitive species of human beings were actually closer to apes than they were to modern humans. And he wasn't talking historically, he was talking about different races of people. That the white Europeans were further away from black Africans than the Africans were from apes. This concept and belief was spread to Germany by Hegel, who shared Darwin's view on this, but took it even further and went as far as to suggest in a veiled way that those who were born with disabilities should be put to death, and that those of other races needed to be subjugated and ultimately, in the long run, eliminated in order to have a pure, higher race. It's not hard to see how this led to Hitler's thoughts on the Jewish people. And Christopher Hitchens was once in a debate and reacted violently to this concept. But the reality is that you just have to read what the professors and scholars at the universities in Germany were saying in the decades after the introduction of the Darwinian theory of evolution to see that this was a widespread belief that was infecting not only Germany, but the entire Western world, partly through social Darwinism and partly through eugenics. And we could see that here in North America as well, that there was a movement that believed that salvation was not to be achieved through Jesus Christ, but by the achieving of a super race that was intentionally bred to make people better. This all helped lead to the massacre of the Jewish people during the World War II. So yes, I do doubt Dawkins. I do not believe that God is this evil being that Dawkins suggests, nor do I agree with him that religion is like a virus and harmful to humanity. Rather, it has been a vehicle of great good. That's not to say the church is without blame. That's not to say that human beings have not done terrible things in the name of Christ. But what I am suggesting is that those things were done in spite of the teaching of Jesus. And I would suggest that much of the damage that modern materialism has done has been as a result of embracing what they say they believe.